is Brian Prestia. I'm the founder of Reason Test Prep. We do GMAT, GRE, SAT, and ACT tutoring. I've personally been doing that since 2003, and we do it all online right now. I've been doing it mostly online since probably 2016 or 2017, and started doing online tutoring in probably 2011 or something like that. So I've been in this world of doing things on a computer for a long time. So I mean, the GMAT and the GRE have been computer based for a while, but yeah, I mean, you know, there's I'll talk about this later on in the conversation, but in terms of getting people comfortable with a computer based tests, you know, doing tutoring on the computer is somewhat helpful, because, you know, you're staring at a screen, and you know, usually when I'm sending documents and things to people, it's sending it digitally and having people do things right on a computer anyway. So yeah, so and I thought I'd just make a point, the last two bullet points there on the slide. So yeah, I mean, I've experience with computer adaptive testing with the GMAT and the GRE. And also I thought I would just add, I have some experience also with computer-based testing, which is what international students are doing with the ACT right now. So yeah, so I mean, the only difference there, right, is computer-based just means you're taking the test on a computer, but it's not adaptive. And computer adaptive test means obviously it's on the computer, but the test is adapting. So I just thought I'd make that distinction up front, that the ACT right now for international students, you know, the students are taking the test on the computer, but it's basically just a computer-based delivery of the test, of the same test, whereas the SAT, it's, you know, the test is going to change and become adaptive. So, okay, and I see the poll here. So it looks like almost everyone's mostly interested in the SAT and a little bit on the GMAT. Okay, so let me just shut that. Okay, let's see. Okay, this just keeps popping up, the poll. Okay, so in terms of the new SAT and how it's going to be computer adaptive. So I mean, College Board obviously released a whole bunch of information about the changes to the SAT. I'm not going to get into all that. I really just want to focus on the computer adaptivity of it. And there's 2 points on here that I've just hit here. So one is it's looks like it's going to be section adaptive, not question adaptive. So the GRE is currently a section adaptive test, and the GMAT is question adaptive. So I'll talk about that in a bit. But basically, question adaptive just means that the test adapts at each question. Section adaptive means that you have a static section where the questions are all predetermined, and then the second section is either, you know, same level of difficulty, easier or harder, just based on how a student does on, how a test taker does on that first section. And that leads to the second point, which is that I don't know, actually, I can't remember if they said it explicitly in their press release, or if it was more implicit. I think it was explicit, but yeah, I think that the reading and writing on the new SAT will have to be combined into a single, like, verbal section, because, you know, you need two sections for each topic or whatever, for each area, because you need the second section to be adaptive after the first. So, you know, with the current formulation of the SAT, then you would need two reading sections, two writing and language sections. Given that the test is going to be 2 hours, you know, that's probably, you know, pretty tough to do. So yeah, again, I can't remember if I was just read between the lines, or if it actually said it, but I would expect that the new SAT is going to have a single verbal section where you have reading and writing combined into a single section. And then how a test taker does on that section will then determine whether the next section is harder, the same, or easier. Okay. Now, benefits of computer adaptive testing. I mean, one easy benefit is that you get your scores faster. With the GMAT and the GRE, you get your scores right away. That, for me, as someone who takes these tests, it's so hard to take a test where I don't get my score right away anymore. It's painful to have to wait. So the SAT, I think they said it's going to be a few days. It's not going to be immediate, because they probably have to just verify that there weren't any inconsistencies in the delivery of the test or whatever. But I mean, the GMAT and the GRE, you get it immediately. So faster scores, they say in their press release, more secure. I mean, I think it's got its own security issues when you're delivering a test on the computer, obviously, but not everyone's seeing the same questions, right? So, some people are going to see a harder section, some people are going to see an easier section. And so you don't have a single test that everyone is taking. And therefore, it's a little harder to cheat because you don't actually know exactly what you're going to see. It's dependent on how you perform. That said, the GMAT and the GRE have had cheating issues. I mean, I know of at least one with the GMAT, and I think I've heard of one with the GRE as well. But obviously, if you knew all the questions that were in all the possible sections you could see, you might not know exactly what you're going to see, but you would still have an advantage. So it's not entirely secure, but maybe it's a little bit better than having a single test that everyone is seeing. And then more accurate, I'll talk more about this in a minute, but basically, I'm not a psychometrician, so this is just my understanding of having done this for many, many years. But my understanding, the way the GMAT and the GRE, especially the GMAT, are scored is that you're essentially judging a test taker on sort of what's their level, meaning what's the level below which they're generally getting the questions right, and above which they're generally getting the questions wrong. So sort of like, where is their breaking point? And that's an accurate way to figure out where a person stands, right? So like, if you're getting a 700, let's say, that means that, questions that are below the 700 level mark, you're generally able to get them right. And above the 700 level mark, you're generally getting them wrong. So this is not exactly how it works, but roughly something like that. So you can get much more, in the weeds on that when you can see individual questions and you're judging how a test taker answers each individual question. How do they answer a 750 level question? How do they answer a 700 level one? How do they answer a 650 level question? With the with the current SAT and the ACT, you're really just getting, okay, let's just look at how many questions the person got right or wrong, but you're not really looking at which questions they got right or wrong. So I'm sure you guys can understand this, but you can have someone who's at a very high level, let's say in math, right? They're great at math. They're great at the math section of the SAT. They're capable of getting the hardest questions right, but they make stupid mistakes and careless mistakes. So they're getting 800 level questions right, but they're missing 500 level questions sometimes just because they're being careless. Well, theoretically, that person is probably somewhere near an 800 level, and yet they're getting punished for careless mistakes that maybe don't actually reflect that person's ability. So anyway, without going into too much detail, I would say that, when you're delivering a computer adaptive test, I think it's a more accurate way of scoring. Okay, now the GRE. So like I said, the SAT, it's going to be modeled after the GRE with the section adaptivity. So let me just explain a little bit about how the GRE does that. And I'm assuming that the SAT is going to be the same. I mean, they're both made by ETS, both the SAT and the GRE. So I think it's a good guess that it's going to be very, very similar. So first of all, as I said before, the first section is like a medium level section. Now, the second point here is about how it's still a mix of levels of difficulty. So it's not like every question is medium, right? Like you're going to get some easy, some medium, some hard, but it's relatively balanced. And then based on the number of questions you get right in that first section, then determines how hard the next section is. So, if you get above a certain threshold right, you get a harder section. Again, that doesn't mean it's all hard questions. You'll still see, some easy ones, some medium ones, and some hard ones, but the proportion will get shifted where you get a lot more hard ones, fewer medium and very few easy, basically. And then, obviously if you're in sort of the middle of the pack on the first section, then you're going to get another sort of medium level section. And if you do poorly on the first section and miss a lot of questions and you're below a certain threshold, then you're going to get an easier section. But I think the way the GRE works is that it's like three different, it forks into like three different paths, like a harder, a medium, and easy. Theoretically, there could be nuance in between there, but I think it's basically like a harder section, a medium one, and an easy one based on that first section. In terms of why, section adaptivity versus question adaptivity, again, I'm not a psychometrician, so I don't know exactly the details behind this, but I remember when the GRE switched from being question adaptive to section adaptive. That was like in 2011, and I remember them trumpeting the idea that it's more like a paper and pencil test, because so this is a key distinction on the GRE, because the 20 questions that you get in a section are predetermined, so that, like, medium level section that you get first, you can skip around. You can skip questions and go back because all the questions are already predetermined. So it feels, I mean, it's delivered on a computer, but it feels a little bit more like a paper and pencil test, and that you can skip questions, go back. And that's a major strategy feature of the GRE versus the GMAT, which maybe let me turn to that. Let me bring up that slide. The GMAT is question adaptive. And so what that means is the test decides which question to give you based on how you answer each individual question. And so you can't go back, because once you've answered a question, the test then spits out the next one, and that was determined by the one that you just answered. So there is no going back. You can't skip around in the section. You have to answer each question in order. And so anyway, that's one advantage of a section adaptive test, is that you can get it to feel a little bit more like the current version of the SAT, a little bit more like a paper and pencil test. I think, again, the caveat that I'm not a psychometrician, but I think that a question adaptive test is probably a bit more accurate, because again, you're getting into a granular level and looking at exactly which questions a person gets right or wrong, and so you can have a more refined judgment about that person's ability. Whereas going back to the GRE, to my knowledge, and I'm pretty certain about this, it doesn't judge you based on which questions you get wrong within a section. It's just judging how many you get right or wrong. So like on the current GRE, for example, on the first math section, you need to be getting 15 or 16 right, I would say, out of 20 to bump up into the harder section. And if you get anywhere between, say, maybe like 8 and 15 right, something like that, you go to a medium section. And if you're below 8 right, you're getting, the easier section. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which questions you're getting right. So I'll get to that in a second in terms of strategy. So yeah. So anyway, I think the question adaptive test is probably ends up being a little bit more accurate. But you lose the user friendliness of the not being able to go back to questions and skip questions and stuff like that. I have to say, just as an aside, as someone who's done a lot of GRE tutoring, it's very hard to get people to skip questions anyway. So it's like, yes, in theory, it's more like a paper and pencil test, but yeah, it's very hard. I mean, it's hard to do it even on the SAT and the ACT when it's paper and pencil, I guess, but somehow even harder on a computer delivered test, because you're only looking at one question at a time. So to get someone to just skip, it feels like they're never going to go back to the question when they can. So from a tutoring perspective, it's very hard to get people to really capitalize on the fact that they can skip questions and go back on the GRE, and I'm assuming it'll be hard on the SAT as well. Okay, so that leads nicely into this next slide. So test taking strategy implications for the SAT. Honestly, not much really is basically my high level here. One is, yes, you want to do well in the first section, duh. That's going to determine how well you do on what section you see next. I just remembered I didn't maybe explain something as well as I should have about the section adaptivity, so I'll go back to that. But anyway, yeah, so obviously you want to, it pays to do well in the first section so that you get that harder section. But from a test taker's perspective, that information isn't very helpful, right? Like, of course, they want to do well in everything. So just telling someone like, look, you really got to do well in that first section, otherwise you're not going to get to the harder section. I almost would, yeah, I mean, I don't really say that to people. If anything, that just puts pressure on them to try to do, to do things that maybe they wouldn't ordinarily do. So you can't do much with that information. You just, hope that you do well in that first section. So let me just backtrack for a second. Sorry, I didn't quite explain the scoring. Basically, the way the section adaptivity works is that it's like a weighting system. So the first section is medium, it's judging how many questions you get right. That determines whether you get a harder section, a medium one, or an easy one. And then, if you get a harder section, you can afford to get more questions wrong, right? You don't have to get as many right, and you will get a higher score, because there's essentially like a weighting system that goes into it. So, and on the opposite, if you do poorly on the first section and get an easier section, you can get all 20 questions right on the GRE, and you're not going to have a good score. You're essentially bracketed into kind of a range based on whether you're in that low, medium, or high section. So you really, if you want to get a high score, you have to get into that high section. And then at that point, it's just getting as many questions you can right within that section. So yeah, so it does matter, it does help to do well in the first section and get into that harder section. Otherwise, there's just an upper boundary on what you're able to achieve, even if you're getting everything right. Okay, so that leads to maybe the second point here. Misconception about early questions. I read a few blog posts from some people that I really respect in our industry, and maybe I was just misinterpreting what they were saying, but it seemed like people were saying, one strategy implication is that you have to do well on the early questions. Yeah, I may have misunderstood what they meant by that, but you just have to do well in that first section. It doesn't matter which ones you get right or wrong within that section. So yeah, whether you get the early ones right or late ones right, I mean, that doesn't matter. It's just sheerly number of questions right within the section. That's all it is. Now, the third point about don't waste time on the questions you might miss, this connects to the second point. But on the GRE, within the section, the questions are not put in order of difficulty, right? So they're scrambled. On the SAT, the questions generally go in order of difficulty. So I guess I don't know what's going to happen with the new SAT, if it's going to continue to go in order of difficulty, or if the questions will be scrambled within the section. If it goes in order of difficulty, well then, okay, I suppose then, yes, you could say you should try to, do well in the early questions, but not because they matter more, but only because, they're easy, basically. And so you want to capitalize on those easy questions. But that's the same strategy as the current SAT, right? Is to, get the easier questions right and not rush through them, trying to get to the harder questions that come at the end if you're not likely to get those right anyway. So I'd say, that strategy won't change if the questions are still placed in order of difficulty. If they're like if they change it to the current version of the GRE, where the questions are scrambled, well, then there is more of a strategy component to thinking about whether you should do a question or not. So that's definitely something I spent a lot of time on with people, is helping them assess whether it's worth doing a question, right? Like how long is it going to take? Are they likely to get the question right? And making a good judgment about that before they start spending any time on the question. So yeah, I guess that remains to be seen. If they end up scrambling the order of difficulty within a section, then that'll be, I think, an important strategy thing that students will have to understand. But if it stays with the current format of the SAT, where it just goes kind of in increasing order, then yeah, I mean, obviously spend time on the early ones, try to get them right, just because they're easier, and don't rush to get to the hard ones that come at the end. Okay, last slide here before maybe we can do some questions. And I have this sinking feeling that I've left some important stuff out. So I'm assuming we get to the questions, you guys will hit me with those things. Yeah, hopefully I didn't leave anything major out. But anyway, reasons to remain calm. Like I said, there just isn't, if it's section adaptive, there just isn't a whole lot of test taking strategy that's needed for that. Again, that would change a little bit if the order of difficulty of the questions is scrambled, but if not, I mean, there's just really, it's pretty much the same as the current SAT, I would say, from a sort of time management perspective. The GMAT is totally different. That's the only reason I even make the point. I mean, there is a lot of strategy that goes into the GMAT because you can't go back to questions. And so there's definitely a lot of coaching I do with GMAT students about how to optimize given the way the algorithm works. But yeah, section adaptive tests, I don't think there's just not much strategy around that. It's mostly just, not spending time on questions that you're not likely to get right, basically. The second thing is testing on a computer is not that different. Again, I have tutored some international students who have taken the computer-based version of the ACT, and I've tutored hundreds of people for the GMAT and the GRE, and that's all been computer-based since I've been doing it. And it's just not that big a deal, I think. I mean, most students adapt to it pretty quickly. For the GMAT and the GRE, some people are shocked at first, like, I can't believe I gotta do this on the computer. And then, I don't hear another word from them about it after that, like, initial shock. And even with the kids I've tutored for the ACT who are international students, yeah, even that, I mean, and, I'll get to this point about official practice tests. That's part of the issue is, how much official practice do you have? I'll mention that in a second. But yeah, I mean, it just doesn't seem to be that big of a deal really to take the test on the computer, especially, teenagers, they're used to being on a computer anyway at this point. So I just don't think it's something to get too bent out of shape about. The main things are the third point and fourth point. The main things are practicing on the computer screen, right? Or on some kind of a screen. Like I said, when I tutor people for the GMAT and the GRE, even if they're not doing official practice tests, like, I have them do questions off of PDFs basically. And, same thing if I'm tutoring an ACT kid who's going to take, who's in, London and going to take the test on a computer, I basically will have them do pretty much all their practice off of the screen. So they get used to that. Used to not, especially for geometry questions, having to like redraw a diagram or whatever. Again, it's just not that big a deal. That's what every GMAT and GRE person has to deal with. But you just want to get some practice at that. The last point, I think, is the thing that worries me the most, just from a, prep, a tutor, test prep perspective, is that, of course, every time they change the test, it's like annoying to have official practice material to use. So when the GRE changed in 2011, there was like one book. I mean, there's still not that many questions for the GRE, official questions. But there was like 2 official practice tests and like not that many questions to practice from. And same thing with the SAT when it rolled out in 2016. So having official computer-based practice tests will be really a big deal, right? I mean, you want to get people to be able to practice on the format of the test. I anticipate that there's just not going to be enough for the most of the people that we deal with. As professionals, maybe people are only going to take 2 practice tests, they'll be fine. But if you're tutoring a kid and you want them to take 8 practice tests, like there probably aren't going to be 8 practice tests in the beginning. So, and I mean, even the GMAT and the GRE, there's only 6 official GMAT ones and 5 computer-based GRE ones. There's 2 paper-based ones also for a total of 7. There's only 5, and it's 11 years old now. They still only have 5 official, and the GMAT goes even further back, and there's only 6 of those. So yeah, that's going to be an issue. But as I wrote in that bullet point, I think there's always some solution to that. You just have to get creative with it. So for example, when I'm tutoring GRE and GMAT people, if I feel like they need to do a lot of official or a lot of practice tests, I ration out the official ones, right? So I don't have them do them until they're ready to do practice tests. And then I don't burn through all of them quickly. So I'll use third-party tests, and there's a whole bunch of different ones out there, obviously, right? There's Kaplan, there's Manhattan Prep, there's tons. So I have my own ones that I like and don't like, but you have to maybe dip into third-party resources a little bit to get official practice. Hopefully, someone on this call will create good third-party practice tests before the SAT rolls out, or someone who could create them. Yeah, I think you just have to get creative with the resources that you use, and especially in the first year of it, that's probably going to be necessary. That plus, maybe advising people to take the ACT. I hate to say it, but I think ACT will win market share as people are, uncertain about what to do with the new SAT. So, okay. I'm sure I left a lot out. I'm sure you guys will point it out to me. So yeah, I don't know if what's the best way to do the questions, Kevin?